Hi everyone, it's Jason Torrance here. I'm the Policy Director at UK 100 Cities, the chair of this webinar. We're just going to give it another couple of minutes for some other people, about another minute for people to log on, then I'll kick us off. But welcome everyone. Okay, I think if we start now, welcome everyone to this Smart Transport Climate Emergency Decarbonisation of Transport Challenges and Opportunities webinar, one of many webinars I'm sure we're all participating in at the moment, but I hope this one will be one of the more memorable webinars. We have a really fantastic lineup of speakers for you today. Each will be presenting for about 10 minutes, most I think with presentations, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. And please, if you've got any questions, type them into the questions box in the control panel, and I'll post them to the panel. Of course, just the panelists are able to speak and everyone else is muted, but please do raise any questions in the questions panel on your control panel. So it's just past 11. We're looking to conclude about 12:30 today. As I said, we've got 6 speakers for you that are introduced in turn. But just to outline, we have first Greg Marsden, who's Professor of Transport Governance at the University of Leeds. We then have Frank Moulon, who's head of ABB's Global E-Mobility Infrastructure Solutions. We then have Elliot Traherne and Rosalind O'Driscoll from the GLA, London City Hall. And then we have Daniel Ruiz, who's the Chief Exec of Zenzik. And then we have Chris Jackson, who's the head of fleet and transportation at Centrica. So a fantastic lineup. I just urge again anyone that's just recently joined to write any questions as we go through in the questions pop out on the control panel. Smart Transport Climate Emergency, Decarbonisation of Transport Challenges and Opportunities, sponsored by ABB and Centrica. So thank you everyone for attending. So if I just hand over firstly to Greg Marsden, a Professor of Transport Governance, University of Leeds, who will be talking and presenting for about 10 minutes. Over to you, Greg.
Hi everyone, I think I'm unmuted now. So I'm very pleased to be given the chance to talk to you today about the climate emergency, what now? I'm currently running a decarbonisation initiative across the north of England called Decarbonate, which is looking at place-based decarbonisation solutions, working with the local government association on So You've Declared a Climate Emergency, what next? Advice for local authorities and a range of other climate and energy programs. So it's a very dynamic, interesting, challenging time, and I'll give you some perspectives on kind of the coming together of the climate emergency and the COVID crisis over the next 10 minutes. So it's not that long ago that we were here and kind of recognising the scale of the climate emergency. Net Zero, the Committee on Climate Change's report in response to the Paris Agreement commitments back in May 2019, so you know, a year ago, and this essentially recognised that all sectors and all parts of all sectors had to be part of the solution. We were no longer 80% and everyone hiding in the 20%. The other important part of the Net Zero report was just a kind of refresher that therefore everything's included in the budget, and if we go slowly on any part of the emissions reduction trajectory early in the period, that means we have to go even faster later on in the period. So the kind of the need for early action was recognised. Remember this, not all that long ago, late summer 2019, school strikes, Extinction Rebellion, and a feeling that, you know, for the first time in a long time, that there was a groundswell of real desire from the population for action rather than inaction. And actually some of the taboos maybe around transport and reducing travel demand and so on, people were up for seeing a change in how that happened, and there was a lot of local pressure therefore put on councils to say, well, what are you going to do to try and solve this problem? So early 2020 then, we were commissioned by the local government association to have a look at the situation. And I suppose it's not, it wasn't a hugely positive position that we were looking at. Emissions from the transport sector have been broadly flat since 1990 on a slightly rising trend over the last 4 or 5 years. Big increase in SUV sales, for example. But 2/3 of local authorities have declared climate emergencies. But when you look at what's actually in the climate emergencies, there's very little clarity on what that really means for transport, whether it's actually all of the emissions within an area or whether it's just what a local council was going to do. If you think about the clean air zones, we had certain local authorities deciding to exclude private vehicles, for example, from the restrictions and only focus on bus and goods vehicles. So a relatively timid approach to that. We had declining bus services in most areas and even in London. I say patchy rail performance, some disastrous timetable changes. I mean, the service across the north of England sort of almost fell apart for an extended period of time. Relatively glacial progress on cycling and walking, and you can point to a few places that were really getting on with this and doing it well. Even EV growth was behind where we needed to be on the adoption curve. So there wasn't really a downward trajectory on emissions, and you set that against a requirement of reductions of between 6 and 14% per annum, and that depends on which set of assumptions and levels of ambition you want to see adopted. So our assessment of looking at the state of play was that we had a lot of ambition, but we didn't necessarily have the action plans behind that. Okay, so the New context then in 2020 is the outbreak of the coronavirus. Obviously the advice to stay at home before we were advised to just stay alert and probably stay at home. It did see a collapse in trips for all sorts of different forms of transport, and a realization that actually the amount of road space that we have available for people to just move around on foot, by bike, it's not sufficient for social distancing. In this time period, we also had the launch of the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. So the kind of recognition that there is still this long-term climate problem that we need to tackle. So the short-term and the long-term emergencies collide. So what have we seen happening, and what does that mean for what next? Well, one of the first things that's kind of emerged is an appetite for temporary road space reallocation to try and deal with the social distancing problems, but also to take advantage of the fact that the traffic levels have been at around 40% of what they might normally be at this time of the year. I would say the UK authorities were relatively slow to the table here compared to some of our international counterparts, and I think that reflects just some general issues about cycle culture. We recommended this back in 2014 as part of a research project that we did, that there should be more experimental road space reallocation, and we were essentially laughed out of town halls. This is all too difficult to do. So it's great to see this happening now. It has to happen now, because if we're not doing it at a point where traffic levels are low, then when are we going to do it? So I would really push and encourage more of this to be happening. But I think there are some bigger questions, and I put them in a kind of bucket of climate positive and climate negative. So I'm not saying this is a socially positive thing, but there's a lot of debate going on about whether traffic levels are going to bounce back or go beyond previous levels, as people are kind of being told to stay away from public transport. There are lots of reasons why I think traffic levels won't bounce back, certainly not quickly, and why we've therefore got some window of opportunity to act in different ways. The first one is the recessionary impacts, and I've shown on here on the chart on the right hand side that there were, following the global financial crisis, there were 4 years of negative growth or reductions in traffic levels on the roads in England as a result of the recession brought about by the global financial crisis. Now, the estimates of coronavirus on the UK economy thus far are much larger than the global financial crisis, and obviously we don't know just how long the restrictions are going to impact on economic activity, but I would suggest that the impact on the economy as a whole and therefore on traffic levels is going to be a downward pressure for a number of years. But we're also doing things differently, so it's not just like the global financial crisis. There's a massive change in the way society is organising and behaving, and in particular this is exemplified by working from home. So the chart here shows the ONS statistics on the number and proportion of people who mainly work at home, and you can see that it's been increasing very slowly over time. And what we've seen, obviously, with coronavirus is a massive step change in what's happened. So you could see the incremental line as partly a kind of expression of individual interest in working from home, and partly a very slow sectoral adjustment to being able to work from home. But now organisations are doing this on a scale not seen before. They're changing all the rules and regulations to make that possible, and they're having to open up their behaviours. We won't go back to the way we were before. So a critical question is how much of this can be made to stick. Online shopping, similarly, it was on a steeper rising trend. A lot more people are doing a lot more things online. We're not going to go back to the way we were before, and we can capitalise on some of this. But there are climate negatives. Bus and rail system capacity is likely to be as low as 15 to 20%, and it's bleeding millions and millions of pounds as a result of that in providing services at that level of capacity that we need to for key workers. We've got advice to avoid public transport. That clearly will push car use. It may put people off public transport for a long period of time. We really need to understand that. The oil price is incredibly low. That will incentivize car use. but it will also reduce the attractiveness of things like EVs. There'll be a hit on investment for clean technology, both with consumers but also with businesses if the recession does continue to bite. And I saw in the news this morning pressure on local authority budgets already. Are we going to have the skills and capacity, and will it still be there in 12 months' time? You know, when will the magic money tree stop printing money? And how are we going to deal with the deficits that are built up on the other side of that? That is a risk, I think. And then there's a question as to whether the will to restrict will be more timid rather than emboldened. It could go either way, but I think just to remember back 12 months, there was really patchy commitment to restrictions. So we shouldn't just assume that because people have been able to deal with it now, that they will deal with it in the future. So my last slide, what now? Well, I think act early. It's definitely easier to take the action now while not travelling is the message, while levels of traffic on the network are that much lower. The agenda will change as restrictions ease. The message may well shift to getting people moving again, and therefore certain types of action will be more difficult. But what are the next equivalents of temporary road space reallocation? What are the things that we need to get on with in the short run that will really benefit us for climate change in the long run? I think safe cycle routes to secondary schools is a priority before September, because the coach and bus capacity to get students to school will also be at 15 to 20%. And even if only half of school kids are going to school in any one week, we're not going to be able to get them there by bus. We need to avoid moving everyone back into cars for the school run. The remote working transition is going to be more carbon impactful, I think, than some of the temporary road space reallocation. But whose job is it to support the remote working transition and to make sure we get the best out of this? It isn't just a question of making broadband speeds better. What do we need to change in terms of season tickets on transport? What are the tax incentives and expenses regimes that need to change in order to make working from home more attractive in the long run? Demand responsive transport, I would say now is the time for us to be investing a lot in this as part of the future of mobility strategy, but also the climate strategy. And I think it could be helpful in terms of managing the movement of people in safe, socially linked groups as part of the coronavirus crisis. How long are we going to continue to run really big buses at 15 to 20% capacity? Perhaps this is an opportunity for innovation. Rethink the high street. We're not going to go back to the level of retail offer that we had before. So what's the size of future UK town centres, and how are we going to plan for that? How can we get more local retailers accessing people's houses through home delivery? And finally, localising the UK leisure market. The amount of emissions from long distance travel is huge. This is an experiment in how people are going to holiday within the UK market. How can we capitalise on that? So it's great to see all the temporary road space reallocation coming along, but I think there's a whole series of bigger questions and issues that need to be addressed if we're really going to capitalise on the carbon potential of a climate smart recovery. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Greg. That was really, really clear and really thought-provoking. So for those of you that have recently joined, welcome to this Smart Transport Climate Emergency Decarbonisation of Transport Challenges and Opportunities webinar. So we've just had the first of 6 speakers. We're going to be running through till about 12:30 today, and I'd just like to invite everyone on their GoToWebinar control panel to ask any questions in the questions panel. I will come to the questions after all of the speakers are finished at the end, and we have at least half an hour or so of questions that I will ask. But yeah, fantastic to see. I think we've got just over 270 people now on the call, so welcome. And I'd just like to introduce our second speaker today, which is Frank Moulon. who's the head of ABB's Global E-Mobility Infrastructure Solutions. So over to you, Frank. So about 10 minutes from Frank now. You just need to unmute yourself, I think, Frank.
All right, so I hope you can see my screen. So let me dive you through now after Craig's presentation, which was on the environmental impact itself. Let's now look a bit on the technology side. So what can we do in terms of electrifying infrastructure for bus fleets? And I brought a few examples on how this can be done. So as ABB, if in case you don't know our company, we are actually operating in 4 global businesses, all in market position number 1 or number 2, the largest being electrification, where we electrify everything from a substation down to the point of use. And this is also the home for our e-mobility infrastructure business, which I lead. So we are well positioned across global markets in that business of electrification, and also in a similar share in electric charging infrastructure. So ABB might also be known for our partnership with the Formula E. So it's now called the ABB Formula E, and we're all hope that the races will continue and that we will see a final double header this year still in London. So that's still on. So let's really cross the fingers it will happen. So now in terms of what does it take from our point of view to bring zero emissions in transportation forward, we believe it's simply 4 pillars to make that happen. So one is the availability of vehicles, which is not yet where it should be. So there's more and more cars, more and more bus OEM coming out with new models. But that of course needs another push to really make a significant impact so that everyone can really choose from the offering. Second, of course, those need to be charged. So it's all about the infrastructure out there. That's of course the element we're significantly working on, and I will show you later. And then it might also need grid reinforcements. Also here we work on and to reinforce the grid or to mitigate the reinforcements. And fourth, of course, the transition only makes sense if we also continue to push heavily into renewable power generation. So only then the whole value chain makes sense. So the good news is now, if we look at what is planned to be added on power generation, so we can see in both OECD countries as well as non-OECD countries that the majority of new generation to cope with the additional demand is really out of renewable energy. So that's really the good news. Yeah. And if we look at the grid reinforcement, there is usually, depending on how you look at it, but on the medium voltage side, there are upgrades needed, especially when it comes to medium voltage switchgear and transformers. So that needs to be checked when you install and you have larger installations of infrastructure. However, you can also mitigate part of that when you install locally battery energy storage systems. And so that can really mitigate the upgrade need for the grid. So, but that's a detailed calculation we have to do side by side. Now, our business for the infrastructure piece, we believe we have quite a strong position there in terms of DC chargers. So just to give you some figures here, we already have more than 14,000 DC fast chargers deployed in more than over 80 countries, and that's mainly in the Western world, so in the Americas and mainly Europe. So not so much in China, which is a different play there. That brings us to a market-leading position in the Western world, and we have about 700 employees and a lot of IP. We just recently opened a nice facility in Delft in the Netherlands for R&D, and you can drive inside that facility buses or trucks to really do testing and interoperability. So if we look at the charging technology in different segments, different buckets, it looks like from our point that there is, at least for car transportation, there is 4 different use cases. There's the home and workplace, which is mainly AC charging. There is parking 1 to 3 hours. That's, let's say, slower DC charging. And then we have the typical commercial space around retail shops within cities, like 50 kW. And then we have the locations you don't want to spend too much time at highways, etc. So there we have chargers 150 and 350 kW. Also in the UK, we're team up with the Ionity network. So all the chargers in Ionity UK are from ABB. The bus and public transportation looks different. There, the charging is, of course, everything is much more plannable. It's fleet, which is behind, so you know your routes, you know when you will drive, you know when you will charge. So everything is more plannable, and so you also align differently to it. But also the batteries are much bigger, so you have a higher demand on power. So there's actually 2 ways of doing that. One is to charge overnight at a depot, and the other is to do that on the route, usually at an end stop, because you don't want to have too many of those chargers, but at an end stop, so that's preferable. And then, of course, there is mixed situations. So it's not only depot or only en route. You can also mix depending on the geographies and distances. If you now look inside a depot, you have, again, 2 options. One is a classical connector charging, usually on CCS protocol, or you can do it with a pantograph. If you go on the route, it's usually a pantograph only, because you don't want to have cables hanging around and you want to automate it. And for the pantograph, there's again 2 options. One is the panto comes down from the infrastructure, so that makes the bus lighter. And you can also use one panto for many buses, or another philosophy, the panto comes up from the bus to the infrastructure, so you can potentially also use that to charge inside the depot. So both is possible. And the way we support that is we try to standardize and maximize the use of the power conversion as much as possible. So you see always the same power cabinet and only different ways to the vehicle, by cord or by pantographs. So also very nice, if you look in depot charging, what you can do is you can do a sequential charge, for example. So because if you want to charge a bus overnight, you can actually connect many buses to the same charger, and then just switch it through. Basically, when one bus is charged up, you switch to the other bus, and then to the next bus. So like this, you can minimize the cost of the infrastructure you need to deploy. So there's also a YouTube video you can watch if you wish. Then again, you cannot only look at it from a charger's point of view. A charger is basically the final stage in such an installation. But especially for buses, and where you have a couple of megawatts then in the depot, you really also need to look at integration with energy storage potentially, or integration with renewable, integration with the transformers and medium voltage switchgear. So it's important you look at the whole chain of the flow of the electrons, and really to make it a smooth experience here. And also mentioned that earlier, if you look towards the energy management, also on a site level, if you do nothing, if you simply install without too much intelligence, your peak consumption can be quite high. So already by mitigating that peak consumption, for example, based on the sequential charging, that's one option, or on a better timing when you charge, you can really reduce your peak consumption significantly, and like this, reduce the annual energy cost you actually have to pay significantly. Now, just a few live examples. This is a picture out of the bus depot in Hamburg, northern part of Germany. It's quite a significant depot here. Let me show you the schematics. So what they did is in this depot you will have more than 100 buses in that depot, and they're actually sequentially charged by 44 of those power cabinets, and to each power cabinet 3 boxes. So this is how it's done overnight. And we looked at the whole chain of the electrification. So from the charger backwards, there's also then the low voltage switchgear, there's transformer, that resi block, and there's medium voltage switchgear. And of course, there is a power management control software over it. And the approach done here in order to save space was even to build a penthouse on top of that depot, because space is quite limited. But I think it's quite a nice example what can be done at scale. It's to date so far the largest bus depot for electric bus depot in Germany. And this is another example. It's a bit smaller, but I still like it a lot because also, just like Hamburg as well, it's playing with different bus OEM brands. This is in Norway, in the city of Trondheim, and it's now covering not a city, but really going outside the city to different areas. And here it's a nice combination of a depot charge overnight, but also at the end stations, which you see on the left picture, there is pantograph chargers actually installed, so that the size of the battery doesn't need to be too large. The bus driver has a short layover of 6 to 10 minutes at the end of the line, and can in that time easily recharge the battery to continue the journey. So this is just pictures. So we also do that in the UK, luckily, not at that scale yet, but we were there. So this is one example together with Volvo at Birmingham Airport. And this is another one at the historic city of Harrogate. So it's also together with Transdev. So I think this is nice examples to show what can be done and what we can do to save the planet. Thank you very much, and give back to Jason. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Frank. Really, really great. And welcome to others that have joined this webinar. We're just over 270 people on this webinar now. So welcome, everyone. So that was our second of 6 speakers on this webinar. So now I'm just going to introduce Elliot Traherne, who's the head of air quality for the Greater London Authority, and also Rosalind O'Driscoll, who's senior policy and program officer for air quality at the GLA, who are going to talk for about 10 minutes. And I just encourage everyone, if they haven't asked questions already in the questions box in the control panel, please do so, and we get to the questions at the end after all the 6 presentations. So about 10 minutes now for you, Elliot and Rosalind.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jason. Good morning, everyone. My name is Elliot Traherne, and today I'll be presenting on London's air pollution story with my colleague Rosalind O'Driscoll. I'm actually wearing a shirt and tie for the first time in ages. So I'm hoping that will improve the quality of the presentation. But what we wanted to do today was just to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing to improve air quality, which I'll cover in the first part of the presentation in London. And then as part of the second part, my colleague Rosalind will talk a little bit about the impacts of COVID-19 and what our plans are going forward. So to start, why is air pollution such an important issue, and how does it fit into this conference today around smart transportation, and particularly with the focus of this session on climate change? I think the reason why air pollution is so important to the mayor is because of the extensive health evidence about its impacts. And you can see here a list of the stats that exist around its impacts on Londoners, with over 2 million Londoners living in areas that exceed legal limits, resulting in thousands of premature deaths each year, and having a whole range of effects, including stunting the growth of children's lungs. I think more recently, we've seen the relationship between air pollution and the most severe effects of COVID-19, which is a really powerful reminder about why taking action on air pollution is so important. And I think it's also worth remembering that the impacts of air pollution do not fall equally across society, but disproportionately affect the most vulnerable and the poorest and those from minority groups. And as a result, tackling air pollution is not just about health, it's not just about the environment, it's fundamentally an issue about social justice. And I think the other key lesson to take away is that in terms of tackling climate change, especially with the links as I'll be talking about today in terms of the work we're doing on transport, unless we tackle London's air pollution problem, we are not going to be able to successfully tackle the climate emergency. And so it's really important that we take an holistic approach to these issues and that we have an integrated way of working. Just to run through some further information about the air pollution problem that London faces. This is a map of nitrogen dioxide concentrations in 2016, which is the last inventory that we have available. And you can see that anything on this map in yellow exceeds legal limits. And you can see in the center of the city, you can see in stark relief, reds and oranges and the road network even in those kind of purpley colors. When you get into inner London, you can still see a lot of yellow, particularly on the road network, which stands out in stark relief. And then even in outer London, again, you can see those roads really clearly mapped onto the map, as well as Heathrow Airport in the corner. So as a result, you can see the really strong relationship between road transport emissions and air pollution in London. And when you look at the sources of NOx in London, that becomes even clearer, with around half of the problem in terms of emissions in London coming from road transport. And when you break that down further, you can see the proportion of those emissions that come from diesel vehicles, whether it's buses, vans, cars, or heavy vehicles and taxis. So tackling the problem of pollution in London, and therefore by extension also tackling the problem of climate change, it does require us to make sure that we've got some really ambitious and bold policies in relation to road transport. And luckily, the Mayor of London actually has some very strong powers in those areas. We've taken an integrated approach. As you can see here, we have 3 key strategies which address some of our environmental issues, air pollution, climate change. And you can see the London Environment Strategy, the Mayor's Transport Strategy, and the London Plan. And the reason that having a holistic approach is so important is that one of our key interventions, probably the foundation on which everything else is built, is around mode shift. It's around getting people to walk and cycle more and to use public transport more. And of course, as we were hearing earlier, and as Rosalind will talk about a bit more later, in the current context, increasing walking and cycling to maintain social distancing is absolutely vital. So we're quite well served by the fact that we've done all of this policy work and have these strategies in place, which try to take that integrated approach of getting people out of private cars and onto walking and cycling. In terms of the measures that the Mayor is taking to tackle vehicle emissions, the jewel in the crown is our ultra low emission zone. It's a world first. We've launched the first stage of the ultra low emission zone in central London, the kind of mustard colour area right at the heart of the city. That was launched on the 8th of April 2019. Later this year, we are introducing tough standards across the whole of London for heavy vehicles, buses, coaches and lorries. Because of the current COVID-19 crisis, we have decided to delay some of the enforcement of those standards, but the standards will still be introduced from October of this year. And then from October 2021, we want to expand the ULEZ from that central London area for all vehicles, including cars and vans, up to the north-south circular to cover inner London. Some of the key things to know about the ultra low emission zone are shown on this side. It's 24 hours a day, every day of the year. Vehicles have to meet strict standards or pay a daily charge. For petrol vehicles, it's the Euro 4 standard, and for diesel vehicles, it's the Euro 6 standard, with slightly different approach for motorcycles. If you don't meet those standards, if you're a light vehicle, a car, a motorcycle, or a van, you must pay £12.50 a day. Or if you're a heavy vehicle, a lorry, a bus, or a coach, it's £100 a day. And those charges are in addition to the congestion charge. To help businesses and those on low incomes prepare both for the initial central London scheme and then for expansion later, we provided £48 million of scrappage funding. Up to £9,500 is available to a small business switching to an electric van. So the scheme is actually quite a generous way of helping small businesses and those on low incomes switch to either cleaner vehicles, or even better, to actually more sustainable modes of travel. Things like using cargo bikes or buying a bike, those kinds of alternatives. The Mayor wanted to lead by example. A key area where we've done this is in terms of the bus fleet. London has a large bus fleet, around 9,000 buses. Since 2018, we've only allowed new double-deck buses, which are hybrid, hydrogen or electric, to join the fleet. We've had a massive retrofit program in place to bring the standards of all our buses up to the Euro 6 standard. Currently, it's actually around now over 85% of the fleet meets that standard. And we've focused those cleaner buses onto low emission bus zone routes, particularly in inner and outer London, and they have delivered significant improvements. To give one example, Putney High Street, which historically has been one of the most polluted streets in London, we've introduced a low emission bus zone, which has reduced the number of hourly exceedances of the nitrogen dioxide hourly limit by over 99%. So it gives you a sense of the impact that we can have by targeting improvements to our bus fleet. In terms of taxes, we've also had a policy in place since 2018 that no more diesel taxis will be licensed for the first time. Instead, they need to be zero emission capable, and you can see here an example of one of those ZEC taxis. We now have over 3,000 of these licensed on London streets, and they've been a very important intervention in terms of reducing emissions from taxis. And also, I think, being quite interesting as a example of the wider electrification of London's vehicle fleets. You can see here the taxi driver is actually plugging the taxi in, and I just want to talk a little bit about the EV infrastructure that we're putting in place. I talked initially about how our first foundation in terms of our policy approach is actually switching people to walking, cycling and public transport. However, we recognise that some vehicles will be needed in the future, and for those vehicles, we want to make sure that they switch to zero emission, including electric options. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that we have the right on-street infrastructure to support that. That includes, as you can see, residential charging, including innovative approaches like using lampposts as the charging point, top-up destination charging to enable those who are out and about and driving, and especially for commercial fleets, including those taxis, rapid charging is going to be very important. We have over 260 rapid charge points currently in place, and we expect to have 300 by the end of the year, subject to any delivery impacts from COVID-19. I'm now going to pass over to my colleague, Rosalind.
Thank you, Elliot. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the immediate impact of COVID-19 measures on London's air quality. And then I'm going to outline some of the new plans to address the challenges of getting Londoners moving safely again once lockdown eases. So the graph at the top of the slide here shows the change in vehicle kilometres driven in London since lockdown measures were introduced. So in the UK, it was around the 16th of March that we started to see the departure from usual travel behaviour. This is when the government strongly recommended social distancing and working from home from those that were able. And important to note that on the 20th of March, we suspended all of our charging schemes. So our congestion charge and our ultra low emission zone and our London-wide low emission zone for heavy vehicles were suspended on the 20th of March. This was to help critical workers. But even though these schemes were suspended, we have seen a significant reduction in traffic. So there's been around a 50% reduction in traffic London-wide compared to 2019. Important to point out that the bottom green line on this graph shows the change in traffic in central London in the ULEZ zone. And the reason that even at the beginning of March, we already had seen a 10% reduction is because in April 2019, we introduced the Central London ultra low emission zone, and that had already reduced traffic flows in central London by 10%. Oh, Elliot, next slide, please. Thank you. So, as I've said, we've seen around a 50% reduction in traffic in central London and across London, and this has resulted in a significant reduction in NO2 and NOx, as you might expect. But interestingly, we haven't seen reductions for ozone and particulate matter. In fact, we've actually seen increases. So the graphs in front of you, the red line is the hourly average concentrations throughout the day in 2020 before COVID measures were introduced. And the green line is the hourly average concentration when the COVID measures had been introduced, and these are London-wide. The blue line at the bottom shows the difference between the pre-COVID and post-COVID hourly average concentrations. And what you'll see is that for NO2 and NOx, there is a negative difference, meaning a decrease. And for ozone and particulate matter, there's a positive difference. So there was actually an increase. We do have seasonal trends for ozone and particulate matter in London, and we do usually see the springtime as when ozone increases, and we have springtime episodes of particulate matter, which are associated with agriculture and ammonia emissions from across Northern Europe. I think this is very powerful because it outlines, even with the best transport policies in the world, more action is needed, particularly on particulate matter. London has adopted the very bold target of meeting the World Health Organization guideline limit for particulate matter by 2030. And I think this outlines here that whilst we can have the most ambitious transport plans, and I think we do, we still need more work on non-transport sources. And there's also more work to be done on transport for the non-exhaust emissions with PM 2.5. So next slide, please, Elliot. Thank you. So I just want to talk very briefly, particularly about the changes in nitrogen dioxide, because they are very interesting. So this graph now shows only sites inside central London. And this time the red line is the hourly average concentrations before the ULEZ was introduced. So starting in the period January to April 2017. And the green line is what the hourly average concentrations were in London in 2020, but before COVID measures. So we've got the ULEZ in place, but we haven't got COVID measures. And the blue line is 2020 once COVID measures were in place. And what you'll see is that there was a significant reduction as a result of the ultra low emission zone before the COVID measures were introduced. So actually, we'd already seen a 35% reduction in hourly average NO2. And this is all sites, not just roadside sites. And then there was an additional 26% reduction once COVID measures were introduced. And I think this is very powerful because it shows the ULEZ, which is a scheme that is proportionate. Obviously, the changes that have come in because of COVID-19 have not been proportionate and have damaged the economy. The ULEZ, which is a proportionate scheme, can deliver even bigger reductions than we've seen from the COVID measures. And these reductions have been even higher at roadside sites. So Marylebone Road and Oxford Street, which are two of our busiest roads, we've seen reductions in NO2 of around a half. Next slide, please, Elliot. So looking ahead, last week the Mayor announced his street space plan. So London faces a huge challenge over the coming weeks and months with getting Londoners moving again, getting Londoners back to work. So our transport network is probably going to be down to around 10% of its capacity pre-COVID. And walking and cycling is really going to be central to how we get Londoners moving. But we're going to have to make sure that this is also done in a way that people can socially distance. So the Mayor's Street Place plan announced that we will be expanding pavements, putting in pop-up cycle lanes, repurposing parking spaces. And this is all with the goal of making sure as many Londoners can travel in sustainable, active and safe ways as possible. And TfL have done some modelling and they estimate that with this plan, we could see a 10-fold increase in the number of kilometres cycling and up to 5 times more walking in London, which is really exciting. So I'll hand back now to Jason, I think, but thank you for listening.
Great, thank you, Rosalind and Elliot. Fantastic presentation. And the third and fourth speaker out of 6, so you're lucky enough to have another 2 speakers as yet to come, each speaking for about 10 minutes. Encourage people again to ask any questions in the questions box. We're up to about 30 questions or so at the moment, so after everyone's spoken, I will ask the questions in groups. But again, just to welcome everyone to this telecom. We're still at about 270 people listening on the call. I'm Jason Torrance, the Policy Director of UK 100 Cities Network. So we're going to be going to about 12:30, and now I'd just like to introduce Daniel Ruiz, who's CEO of Zensic. So over to you, Daniel.
And can you see my screen? Hopefully you can.
Yes. Yeah, we can.
Good. Excellent. Thank you very much for giving me time to speak at this. This is my first COVID webinar. Particularly interesting experience. I'm really pleased at the number of people that have logged on. Very interesting speeches to date, starting with Greg Marsden, who made some very provocative, stimulating comments about a climate smart recovery and the fact that action is needed right now. We cannot wait, which is part of the theme of my presentation. Zensic was created by government and industry to accelerate the self-driving revolution in the UK. That was the remit. We were therefore tasked with channeling about 200 million of investment, which was intended to unite industry, government and academia in the move to a safer, more inclusive and productive mobile future. But I'd like to stress that self-driving is only one part of what many are referring to as connected and automated mobility, or CAM. And you'll note I prefer to refer to this CAM rather than CAT, which would be connected and automated transport, let alone CAV, which is quite commonly used as connected and automated vehicles. Reason being that mobility being the efficient, effective movement of people and goods, that is really what is encapsulating our drive. It's what's going to lead to social and economic change and benefits to society. Those benefits are captured, or the potential for them is captured in the kind of the all-pervading impact of mobility. According to the DWP, there are 6.5 million people with mobility impairments in the UK, and approximately 49% of those actually have disabilities. We need to keep those people moving. In the EU, the transport industry directly employs about 10 million people and accounts for about 5% of gross domestic product. So these are big numbers which we cannot and honestly do not ignore. GDP from transport in the UK was almost 20 billion in Q4 last year, approximately 4% of GDP. And then we start to get on to the numbers that we need to change for ourselves, selfish reasons. UK drivers lost on average 115 hours per person in congestion in 2019, which cost the UK an estimated 6.9 billion. And that time lost is productivity for individuals, is productivity for businesses. On that previous slide, I did not mention the environment, and these are even bigger numbers. 27% of greenhouse gas emissions are caused by transport. Now, those slides from Greater London Authority are extremely compelling. London is particularly hard hit, clearly. I was interested to hear, of course, that a large percentage of the impact is outside London's control. The particulates and whatever coming from abroad, we cannot do anything about. That does not take away from the fact that we have an opportunity here to still make a significant impact and take control of our own future health and environment. One of the ways that has been dreamt up, conceived to address the environmental problem, and one that is strongly espoused by the Automotive Council, is to look at net zero, zero impact, and primarily electric power. But of course, low carbon vehicles are not just electric, and we know that for larger vehicles, electric power is not yet mature enough to make the impact that potential hydrogen fuel cells and things like that could have. Nevertheless, this is clearly a very important area, and that's reflected in the government decision to reduce or remove the number of vehicles that are petrol or diesel driven by 2035. That's causing real challenges for the industry. But actually, even if it weren't, the facts are that although in 2018 there was an increase in share, it's still only 3.4%. And interesting facts are that new cars on sale emit less than 8.3% less carbon dioxide than the equivalent older models. But despite cars being ever more efficient, the average UK new car CO2 has risen by 2.9%. All this says for me is that there's work to be done there, and there is work being done led by Zenzik's sister company, the Advanced Propulsion Centre, and one of the major initiatives there is producing a gigafactory so that we have control over our power source, and the manufacturing industry can take a stake in the provision of batteries, which hopefully will underpin the recovery and growth of the automotive manufacturing sector. But that is not going to solve the environmental crisis in itself. And therefore we need to do more, and that means that we need to recognise that areas which may not be as directly impactful as electric vehicles, we must continue our investment in them. And so Zenzik led a piece of work last year. We generated a roadmap called the UK Connected and Automated Mobility Roadmap to 2030, shown on the screen here. It is not just about technology, so the vehicles are in there, yes, there is infrastructure in there, but those two are sandwiched between the services that we're producing and that end up serving consumers, and also the societal, the people, the government, the legislative, the insurance, the human factors and skills themes that must be pursued to keep this in the round. And in fact, regulation, as we know, is the bedrock to progress in an area like this. That is my phone falling on the ground, apologies. Within this roadmap, the key features are a number of milestones and their interdependencies. So there are over 500 milestones, over 600 interdependencies, the connectivities that give you the sequence that needs to be taken if you want to achieve a certain outcome. This is intended as a strategic document. It is taking away hype. It is as objective as it can be. Put together, as I say, by over 150 organisations from right across the connected and automated mobility community, making sure that there was consensus, for example, on the timing of achievement of the rollout of telecommunications technology, and the timing that is required for the evolution of legislation, things like that. So it is a independency-driven, consensus produced, meaningful document that I would encourage you to have a look at. There's for those that you like playing with numbers and things, there is an interactive version of the map available on the web as well. As I say, self-driving is critical, and it is at the heart of what Zenzik was originally set up to do, but connectivity, the C in CAM, is in many respects more important. Some significant numbers. These are leading indicators of how we can improve traffic, transport, congestion, and the pollution that comes from it. These are the impact statements, so collision warnings, the fact that there have been significant improvements, and the statistics are unequivocal about how technology in vehicles and connectivity between vehicles and between vehicles and infrastructure is beneficial. But more specifically to the subject of this particular webinar, traffic flow benefits from autonomous vehicles could total 25 to 30%. There is a debate about whether they will, because if we do not manage the future of our mobility systems effectively, things can go the wrong way. But we're taking account of the risks, we are managing them, we're going to grab the opportunities that come from a period of hiatus that we're in at the moment. And I do genuinely believe that these benefits are achievable. The second on the page, connected and autonomous driving could reduce congestion by 50%, with benefits from vehicle to vehicle and vehicle to infrastructure communication. And that's simply by reducing the what some people call the slinky effect, or the stress wave effect on motorways in traffic where cars accelerate and decelerate. One of the biggest sources of pollution is brake and tyre wear as much as from tailpipe pipe emissions. So if we can smooth the flow, then clearly we'll have a major impact. Fuel consumption will drop, and there is an estimate that shared as well is an opportunity. So if we can manage our traffic, and this is why mobility is the question rather than transport or just vehicles. Sharing is about mobility. Sharing can mean sharing a vehicle. So I use a vehicle that you then use after me, or it can mean we are sharing occupancy. So there are the two parts of that equation. Coming back to the slide at the beginning, just for reinforcement that there are big numbers involved here, and I think we cannot afford to ignore them. We have momentum, we have capability, we've demonstrated that we can, we've got a skills base in the UK. There is a question at the moment. We're coming to the end of the first phase of funding for the Centre for Connected and Automated Vehicles that spawned Zenzik. We've been waiting for the comprehensive spending review now for a good few months or years, and we don't know exactly when it's going to come still, although there is talk of an early fiscal event later this year. Whether that will address the longer term or just patch over until we get through till next March, it is a key question that concerns me. I'm very keen to kind of drive forwards and make sure that we paint a picture that says we cannot afford to wait, to quote Greg Marsden. We can't wait, but I would say we do have momentum and opportunity, which in some ways is enhanced by this crisis. So I'd encourage you to have a look at what we're doing online on the Zenzik website, zenzik.io, very simple, and I'd be very interested to answer questions later on. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Daniel. Really fantastic. That was the fifth of 6 speakers that we've got for you today. So we've got now coming up for 10 minutes, Chris Jackson, who is Head of Fleet and Transportation at Centrica. He's going to be speaking for about 20 minutes. And then we're for about 10 minutes, sorry. Then we've got about 20 minutes of questions. Now, I'm up to about 40 questions. Perhaps due to my constant reminder to all of you to ask questions. Thank you to everyone that submitted questions. I'll obviously have to group them at the end, and also I'll just remind everyone right at the end, but just to say now, of course, all of the slides will be available on the Smart Transport website after this event. So welcome to everyone, and I will just hand over to Chris Jackson for about the next 10 minutes. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Jason. Are we ready for another webinar? Yes, yeah, come on, we can do this. Not long now. So anyway, afternoon, I'm Chris Jackson. I'm the Head of Fleet and Transportation at Centrica Mobility Ventures. This is going to be a short presentation, so high level only, given the time available. However, if you want to speak to me separately, if you'd like to know anything in detail, I'm sure we can find time for a virtual brew. So what does electrification of transport mean to us? Well, for those that don't know, Centrica is the largest supplier of energy in the UK, the parent company of British Gas, among others. We're committed to helping our customers and communities achieve their net zero emissions goals. And to do so, one of the things that we must do is help enable the transition to electric vehicles. So who is Centrica Mobility Ventures? Well, the team I work in is focused on future mobility trends. So we advise and partner with organisations that want to accelerate the decarbonisation of not only transport, but also businesses and homes. So why are we discussing mass electrification of transport? What's brought us to this point, and why is it not going away? Well, fleets are in an unstoppable transition away from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. And the main reasons for this transition are, well, number one, the Department of Transport plan to ban the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles, including hybrids, is currently being reviewed to bring this ban forward from 2040 to 2035 or sooner. EVs qualify for zero benefit in kind, or company car tax, in 2020, with only annual 1% rise next year and then a cap of 2% up until the 2024-2025 tax year. So that means the driver of a battery electric vehicle can pay over £500 per month less in tax than the driver of a comparable fossil car. Initiatives like EV100, a fine initiative where Centrica, among others, has committed to electrify the entire fleet, so 10,000 vans in our case, by 2030. It's also interesting to see some leasing companies have made their own EV100 commitments. And as Elliot mentioned earlier, poor air quality kills tens of thousands of people every year just in the UK alone, and land-based transportation is the largest contributor to this. So clean air zones are being created across the country. We're even seeing low emission streets in places like London, and a growing trend for more active forms of travel, taking away road space. And since Dieselgate in 2015, market share for diesel cars has fallen from 47% in 2015 to just 26% today. And all signs point to this decline continuing. And the market for electric vans does lag behind that of cars. However, we see this market as having the most to gain from the transition to electric. And I think it's futile to try and predict accurate future sales, particularly at the moment. But from the research that I've seen, the number of EVs in the UK is forecasted to reach around 1 million by 2024, increasing to over 6 million by 2030, and therefore account for around 50% of the total vehicle sales. So all this disruption means that the move to mass electrification is already underway. But it doesn't begin and end with the EV. What's it plugging into? In our experience, for fleet operators, there are wider considerations beyond the EV itself. So distributed energy. Should customers be producing, consuming and storing their own energy? The electrification of transport. How do they create a frictionless experience when using the EV? And the smart home. Integrating platforms that allow them to think of home energy in a completely new way. And for industry, adopt a sustainability program of innovative, low carbon technologies which help mitigate the environmental impact of everything from manufacturing through to sales and normal day-to-day activities. As the complexity of the EV transition increases, we find growing numbers of organisations and fleets are seeking partnerships with energy companies like ours. So as part of the mobility team, these are the verticals that we focus on alongside a growing coalition of partners. And some examples include from the OEM world, so the manufacturers. This is developing end-to-end charging infrastructure, augmenting how our partners gain deeper access to their consumers like Ford and VW. We consult on the electrification strategies like the recently announced partnership with Lotus, and transforming underutilized property, renewable generation and creating new business models. Our partnership with NCP is one example here. And fleet, enable fleet operators to transition to electric vehicles at scale through the integration of infrastructure, energy and optimization. We're working with large car and van fleets directly, with bus operators like Stagecoach and vehicle leasing companies. And in the home, we're building zero carbon communities, so energy traded and stored and shared in local energy markets. And ultimately, with the integration of mobility as a service platforms into these homes. Now, I fully agree with Greg and the earlier point about the role that demand responsive transport will play as part of the mass ecosystem. Big scale electrification requires a long-term vision. Here's ours. And it starts with what we call EV 1.0. And that's the bedrock for everything that follows. So it's everything from site surveys, procurement and installation of charge points, the back office system, solar PV, battery storage, energy trading, electricity supply, and more, all in-house. EV 2.0 is the sophisticated energy tariffs and innovative charging technologies and infrastructure. EV 3.0 builds on creating new experiences for connecting the vehicle with the building with our customers. And EV 4.0, so mobility as a service, means exploring opportunities that come with developing an integrated mobility platform for our customers. And EV 5.0 is the long-term future state of net zero transportation. So the future is all well and good. What's going on now? So fleet mass electrification will require the vehicles, the infrastructure, the energy and the optimization to be part of an integrated system. This is what we provide to our customers today, and it's constantly evolving. The main considerations here are that fleets firstly need to commit to the transition. This means to plan ahead and map out where the infrastructure should go. It must be demand-led, not just where it's convenient for the electricity connection to the grid. The use of renewable electricity. We see this increasingly generated, stored and consumed on site, managed by a single platform. Optimization is about managing your energy in this new world. It also provides opportunity to generate revenue and reduce the overall cost of operation. The key point here is being in control of your own infrastructure. Fleet operators transitioning in ever greater numbers to EVs must have control over their own infrastructure. A business critical user cannot recite a Hail Mary every time they turn up to a public charging point, hoping it's available and letting their customers down if it isn't. You need certainty of charge. We see far too much evidence, even today, of the vehicle and its charging infrastructure being offered independently of each other. The mass majority will not tolerate it this way. They just want the charging experience to be seamless. The vehicle and its charging network should be intertwined and not separate. So the EV transition is underway and our customers' needs are changing. They want a partner that understands how to navigate this tricky transition. And they want to ultimately achieve their net zero emissions goals, to have the right infrastructure in the right place. They want to optimize their energy use and reduce the total cost of operation. And we see a future where the customer, the vehicle, home and workplace are connected, enabling new services beyond simply charging the vehicle, and new experiences replacing the unremarkable relationship with energy and vehicle ownership of today. And in summary, the mass electrification of transport will require the vehicles, infrastructure, energy and optimization to be part of an integrated system. Fleets must commit to the transition, so plan ahead with your partner to map where the infrastructure should go. Demand-led, remember, not just where it's convenient for connection to the grid. Work with the right partner who can help you meet your carbon reduction goals. Be in control of your own infrastructure. Ensure you get certainty of charge. Thank you for your attention today, and I wish you all well. And thank you. And back to Jason.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. That was really fantastic, and one of 5, 6 fantastic presentations. So thank you very much to each of the 6 panelists today, and for the some 270 of you that have stuck with us today. Can I just ask the panelists to put their cameras on, please, because now we've got about 20 or so minutes of questions, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm sure due in part to my constant reminder to everyone to pose questions. We've got a lot. We've got over 40 questions which are taking in groups. But perhaps if I just start with a theme that's come up in many of the questions and just ask you in turn to give a brief answer. We're of course in the middle of a global pandemic, COVID-19. At some point we will continue to move further out of lockdown. What should be the priorities for transport investment as local authorities and central government begin to think about those priorities, and of course how does that relate to tackling the climate emergency? So I'm just going to ask the panelists to respond to that in the order that they spoke. So Greg, over to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I think it's a really interesting question and a big challenge. I think we need to very quickly understand what remote working has enabled in terms of productivity. I think it could fundamentally change the investment case and argumentation based around journey time savings and agglomeration benefits in the economy and so on. So I think I'm much more interested in seeing a kind of post-recovery strategy for investment, which is going to be about rebuilding our public transport and the trust in public transport, about greening the fleets that we've got. We'll have a period where we've got lower transport demand, and if we can accelerate the electrification of the fleet, we can probably get onto the curve that we need to for carbon reduction. So I think a balance of kind of local public transport and electrification, definitely not the big ticket large infrastructure for me.
Great, thank you, Greg. So over to you, Frank.
Yeah, so I believe we see a change right now in the behavior of transportation. I mean, enforced kind of, but there's also some benefits people realize, and in terms of having cleaner cities and having shorter ways partially. So if we can sustain a bit of that going forward, I think that would help. And that means if we really spin that forward, that of course means to have a stronger focus on new energy vehicles, be it electric or hybrid or whatever, right? So, but really getting emissions out of the cities, I think, is core, and to start and kick off these investments now. And there is actually, I think, people are receptive to this. So this is how I see it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Frank. So Elliot and Rosalind, what would be at the top of your priority list, your shopping list?
So I think there's you can almost break it down into two parts. I think there's the immediate opportunity, the immediate way of managing COVID-19 and the social distancing we need to kind of get the economy moving again. Obviously in London, you'll have seen, with, as Rosalind was talking about, the street space plan, there's a huge amount of investment that we need to do in walking and cycling infrastructure. And I think government has made some very positive noises about that, but again, there probably needs to be more done in that area. And then I think as we move to the recovery, there is another important set of work that we need to do, which is actually how do we seize the opportunity that these tragic set of events present us and actually accelerate the transition that we've all been talking about. How do we make sure that we are investing in the conversion of our bus and taxi fleets? And also then, of course, creating jobs in various different parts of the country as a result of building new electric buses and taxis. How do we make sure that we are helping those small businesses and those on low incomes actually meet these new environmental standards which are being introduced in cities across the country, and also to help tackle climate change? And I think there's going to be a role for scrappage and retrofit schemes as part of that, and as a mechanism to help people comply with the new standards that will be introduced as part of the ULEZ expansion. So I think they're kind of the big priorities from our perspective, but I guess the overarching message is there is a real moment of opportunity, and it's absolutely crucial that government provide the help and support that cities and regions need to actually deliver on that opportunity.
Great, thank you, Elliot. Anything from you, Rosalind, to follow on from that briefly?
No, I think Elliot said it all very well. Just to echo that, I think it's going to be really important that we make sure some of these positive changes that we are getting out of the COVID crisis, make sure we keep those changes. And I think communication is going to be really important going forward, that we make sure we're communicating with people what are the benefits, because I think people have got used to the idea of making big personal sacrifices for the protection of public health. And I think if we can keep up that narrative, it's going to be really important going forward.
Yeah, fantastic. So over to you, Daniel. Your priorities going forward. I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I agree with you, Rosalind. The communications piece is absolutely critical. I remember during the Olympics, travel demand management was the unsung hero of our 2012 games, because we actually managed how we have people travelled in and out of London, or whether they went on holiday. It was a monumentally successful event, but of course it's a short-term thing. We've got to try and see how we can sustain that with communications. Accelerating the transition means changing people behaviours above all. Within that, changing behaviour is helped by means of communication and flow of data, such that you can derive intelligence and insights and make some better decisions. That is underpinned by cyber security, cyber resilience. and we haven't talked about it today, but I think that a lot of what we're talking about in terms of connectivity of any kind, whether it's data connectivity or power connectivity, does require cyber security, and we need to invest heavily in what we have a global strength in. We're in the top 3 countries in the world, alongside Israel and America, in terms of cyber security. We have a national cyber security centre. We have and a shameless plug. Yesterday, Zendik launched a feasibility piece of research that had been done by 7 consortia into what's needed to make connected and automated vehicles cyber secure. So I think that work needs to continue. So I say cyber security, telecommunications and infrastructure, and the human factors, talking to people, getting the public aware of what they can do to help ourselves.
Great, thank you, Daniel, and over to you, Chris, as your priorities.
Yeah, it's kind of I kind of agree with obviously all of my previous panelists. I think if I can add something slightly differently to it, then it's on organisations like ours and our partners that to actually show you what you can do today. I think that there's still a lot of fear, uncertainty and doubt, as it were, about what you can and can't do in form of big scale electrification. So it's just being a little bit more proactive and just telling people what you actually can do this stuff today. You've got to be bold, you've got to work with the right partners, but you can make some really big projects happen today. That's kind of, I think that's what I feel I can add there.
Great, thank you. A bit of ambition, always welcome. Thank you, Chris. So some other, one of the other big themes that came up in the questions was, of course, as I'm sure everyone will expect, around public transport. We have a climate emergency, of course, but we have also a public health emergency around COVID-19. And the government are now suggesting or urging people not to use public transport. So what do the panelists think is the future for public transport in the short, medium and longer term in terms of climate emergency within the current context? I'm going to start with with Elliot and Rosalind from GLA as representatives of our biggest city, and then just invite some of the other panelists to chip in afterwards. So over to you, Elliot.
I think if I go first, and Rosalind, of course, feel free to jump in with anything I miss. I think perhaps the place to start is we are still in the middle of this, and it's a very fast-moving situation. And obviously, as the Mayor's made clear, it's really important that in the current context, people are only using the public transport system where they really absolutely have to. And as people return to work, what we are planning on doing and what we're putting in place to enable that is a massive investment in walking and cycling infrastructure through the street space plan to enable people to do that in a safer way as possible while maintaining social distancing. Look, we'll have to wait and see how some of those, how COVID plays out over the next few months and potentially longer. But I imagine that there will still be a really important role for public transport. And as I was talking about, as part of the green recovery that we desperately want to see, I think investment in public transport is going to be really important to actually enable us to tackle those deeply ingrained problems that we face, whether it's the climate emergency or air pollution. And it also creates an economic opportunity to invest in new green jobs, creating those electric products, electric buses, whatever it might be. And we definitely know that what we can't afford is a car-led recovery. We don't want to see the disbenefits that you'll see if everyone just gets back in to their car, or even more people use their car. It's that presents a major policy challenge to us in terms of the issues that we're talking about today.
Great. Anything to add, Rosalind?
No, I think Elliot said it all very well. Just to say that it's been really encouraging to see that the approach we've been championing in London has also matched the level of ambition coming from central government. I was really encouraged to see what Grant Shapps said on Saturday about, you know, prioritising walking and cycling as part of the recovery.
Great, thank you. So anyone else? Chris, Greg, Daniel, Frank?
I'll come in if I can, Jason. The work of Gillian Annable and Christian Brand looking at what we need to do to be climate compliant before the crisis suggested we needed like a 50% increase of public transport use, in addition to complete electrification and big behaviour change to cycling and so on. So I think the question we have to ask ourselves is if not public transport in its current format, if the hit from COVID-19 is really significant, well, then what? So really we'd be talking about permanently reducing the peak and the amount that we travel, and using the COVID impacts to kind of really push down travel demand and do things differently, because as the other speakers have been saying, we can't accommodate this by switching over to cars. We're nowhere on our carbon pathway if we do that. There may be some wider benefits to doing that. We've been spending vast sums of money on trying to accommodate even more people into already full systems during the peak. And actually, you know, if we spent our money building public transport back cleaner, but not necessarily higher capacity, and we changed the way we moved, that could be a way forward. But it would mean being more aggressive on travel demand reduction. It would mean actually accepting it as part of our strategy. It's not really in the current decarbonisation plan narrative at all. And I think the other aside to that would be to look at other forms of what we currently see as public transport, the role of DRT, some of the kind of technical solutions that come out of the sort of space that Daniel's operating in, where we can replace certain types of services with slightly different forms of transport that still maybe appeal to people and are safe.
Great.
Can I just add something to that? Yeah. So yes, where can we apply it? I think first of all, travel demand is about people movement. There's the other half of the equation, which is logistics and freight. And one thing the Auto Council is now considering pushing is a campaign to go for zero-touch logistics, which addresses a number of things. It addresses the fact that there is a reducing number of people that want to drive lorries and vans, believe it or not, lorries in particular. There's also an opportunity through connected and automated transport to make journeys in more controlled environments where there is less risk, there's more influence you can bring to bear. So motorways are just that kind of thing. Similarly, campuses, last mile ports, airports. So there are a number of areas where we can start to roll out logistics solutions which are more efficient, more effective, can go 24 hours, so they contribute to reducing the peak as well. So I think freight is an area where there is some low-hanging fruit, and we need to pursue that, but it requires investment right now, unfortunately. And the big challenge here, I think, again, Greg, you had alluded to it, who's responsible for each of these dimensions of a very complex system of systems? We can't just, there's no one solution to this problem. And the fact that you need to get down from 100% to 15% ridership if you want to have social distancing of 2 meters in public transport is it's not a problem that I personally have to deal with. I don't envy Elliot and Rosalind who are having to deal with that firsthand.
Right, great, thank you, Daniel. Chris, as you're the one panelist without a webcam, I can't see whether you're itching to come in here. Do you want? Have you got anything to say on this point?
Well, I'm not itching, no, but I think the point for me is if you know the trends are all telling us that you know we're going to be more active in our forms of transportation, and that's got to be a good thing. I think what I wouldn't want to see and experience is where those active forms of transportation, you know, walking, cycling, scooting, whatever it might be, you're on a road next to vehicles that are belching out toxic emissions. I think they don't play nicely together. So I would like to see a situation where electrification of transportation is just as important as the more active forms.
Right, great, thank you. We also had a number of questions around charging zones, and of course in London we have the congestion charge and the ULEZ, and around the rest of England there were plans to introduce charging zones. Is now really the time to be either reintroducing or looking to introduce for the first time these kind of zones or charging mechanisms for private vehicles, buses, etc.? So again, perhaps who wants to kick us off on this? Greg, do you want to kick us off?
Really good question. I think very difficult in the months which we're in at the moment. So I think TfL's strategy was the right one. But I think what's really interesting is that, you know, the numbers of deaths which you can point to being brought forward early by air quality, the arguments for excluding vehicles and for not getting on and doing this as soon as we're out of the immediate crisis we're in seem to me to have evaporated. You know, either we're bothered about lives and public health, or we're not. You know, are we only bothered about it because it was so visible, or are we actually bothered about it because it's a real problem? So I think you know, maybe right now is not a time to put the foot on the pedal, but it's not that long away, and we shouldn't let that that message drift.
So, of course, in London, you've got an active or two active charging schemes. What are your plans in London, Elliot and Rosalind?
Do you want to go, Rod, or do you want me to pick that one up? Oh, I think you might be muted.
Thank you. We actually have three active charging schemes. We've got the congestion charge and the ULEZ, which is in central London, and then we've got the London-wide scheme for heavy vehicles. So we have suspended enforcement of those schemes, and that was really to make sure critical workers could move and get around unimpeded. And obviously, as much as we don't want people to jump back into cars, we have to understand at the very present time, in these very specific circumstances for key workers who may now be working on different shifts, some people will have had to drive who hadn't before. But that decision is under review. And obviously, as lockdown starts to ease and as traffic starts coming back to the roads, there will be a decision to make about when those schemes will be reintroduced. I think Greg made a very good point that obviously we've seen that not just the thousands of premature deaths because of air pollution, but the links to COVID-19 and air pollution. And I think that really strengthens the argument for taking action. And we've got such strong evidence that with the Central London ULEZ, which is an emissions-based charge, it really works. It's really improved air quality in central London. And I think it makes schemes like this even more important. That being said, obviously, it's always going to be more challenging to introduce a scheme like this when the economy isn't doing well. And that's why we do have the scrappage schemes to support Londoners who are low income or disabled when we're talking about ULEZ expansion. But it's quite interesting because there was a similar circumstance when we had the financial crash in 2008 with the next phase of the London-wide low emission zone for heavy vehicles. And that was postponed under the previous mayor. And it's interesting that I think that decision is now being viewed in quite a different light. So I think the argument about the environment has moved on a lot in the last 12 years. And I think whilst it may be more challenging now to reintroduce these schemes and to push forward these schemes, such as the ULEZ expansion, I think the cause and the need for them is even greater. Elliot, right. I don't know if you want to add any.
Nothing more from me. I think that covered everything. Great job.
Great. So one last question. We're running a bit over time. So if we just keep going, if that's okay, for another 3-4 minutes, and welcome to onto webcam to Chris in your car. quiet environment outside of a busy household, no doubt. So I suppose the last kind of bigger theme and question, we've talked about a lot of kind of local transport, bus travel, charging schemes, broad kind of priorities, local transport priorities. What's the panel's view on the national priorities that national government should look to invest in terms of supporting sustainable travel that tackles the climate emergency going forward, from central government investment? What are the priorities there? And perhaps starting with you, Chris, perhaps we could have a comment from each of the panelists to finish us off.
For me, it's about delivering on the plans that are already, being talked about. The decarbonisation of transport plan is ongoing. From what I've seen, it seems to be saying the right things. We just hope that then that there is the the political will and the financial mandate to do it. I think that the words are fine, but we just now need to follow through, because there is it feels like there is a window of opportunity. I don't think this crisis, just to make a statement rather than anything else, I don't think this is going to get people to change their V8 twin turbos into an EV. I just don't think it's going to do that. But I think that there is a growing groundswell of people who actually want to do something differently. They see the difference in air quality. They know that now seems to be a good time to do that. So I just want the political weight to be added to that.
Great, thank you, Chris. And Elliot and Rosalind?
I think I'd probably just repeat what I kind of said a bit earlier, and I think there's two stages to this. There's the very immediate response, and I think we're starting to see some positive movement from government in terms of investment in walking and cycling, and I think we need to see much more of it. But I think there's this massive opportunity with the green recovery. As I say, it's very tragic circumstances, but it's kind of beholden on us to try and get the positive out of this. And I think it really is, government has to step up and lead and make sure there are resources in place to enable us to support more walking and cycling, the electrification of those fleets that will remain, so buses, taxis and other commercial vehicles, that we've got the charging infrastructure that we need, that we're supporting the businesses and those on low incomes and other people to actually meet these new environmental standards that are being introduced for exactly the right reasons that Rosalind set out. And I think that we are going to really need that support from government, and I hope that they seize this opportunity.
Great, thank you. Daniel, national transport climate priorities.
I'd say build on existing investment, build on existing work. The future transport zones the DfT are leading, the 5G and other telecommunications investments from DCMS, and clearly the connected and automated mobility work led by BEIS in union with DfT. So build on those, focus on something that will make a big difference across the board. And I'd have to say the zero touch logistics and deployment in regions where they're already doing future transport zones would make sense to me.
Great. And last word, over to you, Greg.
Yeah, I suppose don't repeat what we did after the global financial crisis. So we don't want a big physical infrastructure investment package. Shovel-ready schemes should be about maintenance and local, some of the local schemes we were talking about before. We've got to have this big commitment to demand reduction, I feel, as well as an acceleration of the zero emission vehicles. A big question for me is how we're going to pay for it. What's the fiscal framework that all of this is going to happen in? We were allowing vehicle tax revenues drift away. We're printing money at the moment. We're going to have to find a way back for paying for some of this, and I really worry if we haven't got a clear route out of that we're going to end up slashing budgets here, there and everywhere and making some really poor decisions. So that's occupying my mind as to what the pathway out of this is.
Great, thank you. Thank you to everyone. And that brings everything to a close here. Just some kind of next steps. Just thanks to the panelists. We had, I think, 6 fantastic panelists for you today. 5 really great presentations, and at the peak about 270 people listening in. And thanks to the 160 of you that are still here on the call. So everyone that signed up to this will be sent a link to the presentations. They're of course as well going to be available on the Smart Transport website. That's smarttransport.org.uk/webinars. If you want the presentations, please email Bauer Media, the Smart Transport organisers, and of course thanks to our sponsors ABB and Centrica, and of course for Bauer Media and Smart Transport for making this one of the most memorable webinars that we've had. And thanks to the to everything that we didn't have any gremlins. This is one of the very few, hopefully not speaking too soon, one of the few webinars that I've been in where there hasn't been any problems. So that's been really great for everyone, and I look forward to speaking and seeing everyone soon. But thank you again for participating, and have a good day. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.